Chapter 4. If the proper preparations have been made and the necessary precautions taken, any staged event is guaranteed success. Ethelred the Unready. The candle lit at the barest flick from my mind. Delighted, I snuffed it and tried again. A sidelong glance, a fleeting concentration of my will, and the smoldering wick burst into flame again. I snuffed the flame and sat smiling at the familiar candle. This was the first real proof I'd had as to how far my magical powers had developed in the past year. I knew this candle from my years as Garcon's apprentice. In those days, it was my arch nemesis. Even focusing all my energies failed to light it then. But now... I glanced at the wick again, and again it rewarded me with a burst of flame. I snuffed it and repeated the exercise, my confidence growing, as I realized how easily I could now do something I once thought impossible. "Will you knock it off with the candle?" I jumped at the sound of Aahz's outburst, nearly upsetting the candle and setting the blanket afire. "I'm sorry, Aahz," I said, hastily snuffing the candle for the last time. "You're here to audition for court magician," he interrupted, "not for town Christmas tree." I considered asking what a Christmas tree was, but decided against it. Aahz seemed uncommonly irritable and nervous, and I was pretty sure, however I chose to phrase my question, that the answer would be both sarcastic and unproductive. "Stupid candle blinking on and off," Aahz grumbled half to himself. "Attract the attention of every guard in the castle." "I thought we were trying to attract their attention," I pointed out, but Aahz ignored me, peering at the castle through the early morning light. He didn't have to peer far, as we were camped in the middle of the road just short of the castle's main gates. As I said, I was under the impression our position was specifically chosen to attract attention to ourselves. We had crept into position in the dead of night, clumsily picking our way through the sleeping buildings clustered about the main gate. Not wishing to show a light, unpacking had been minimal, but even in the dark, I had recognized Garcon's candle. All of this had to do with something Aahz called a dramatic entrance. As near as I could tell, all this meant was we couldn't do anything the easy way. Our appearance was also carefully designed for effect, with the aid of the imp's abandoned wardrobe and my disguise spells. Aahz was outfitted in my now traditional dubious character disguise. Gleep was standing placidly beside Buttercup, disguised as a unicorn, giving us a matched pair. It was my own appearance, however, which had been the main focus of our attentions. Both Aahz and I had agreed that the Garcon disguise would be unsuitable for this effort. While my own natural appearance was too young, Garcon's would be too old. Since we could pretty much choose the image we wanted, we decided to field a magician in his mid to late 30s, young without being youthful, experienced without being old, and powerful but still learning. To achieve this disguise involved a bit more work than normal, as I did not have an image in mind to superimpose over my own. Instead, I closed my eyes and envisioned myself as I appeared normally, then slowly erased the features until I had a blank face to begin on. Then I set to work, with Aahz watching carefully and offering suggestions and modifications. The first thing I changed was my height, adjusting the image until the new figure stood a head and a half taller than my actual diminutive stature. My hair was next, and I changed my strawberry blonde thatch to a more sinister black, at the same time darkening my complexion several shades. The face gave us the most trouble. "Elongate the chin a little more," Aahz instructed. "Put on a beard." "Not that much, stupid, just a little goatee." "That's better. Now lower the sideburns." Okay, build up the nose. Narrow it. Make the eyebrows bushier. No, change 'em back and sink the eyes a little instead. For crying out loud, change the eye color. Make 'em brown. Okay, now a couple of frown wrinkles in the middle of the forehead. Good. That should do it. I stared at the figure in my mind, burning the image into my memory. It was effective, maybe a bit more sinister than I would have designed if left to my own devices, but Aahz was the expert, and I had to trust his judgment. I opened my eyes. Terrific, kid, Aahz beamed. Now put on that black robe with the golden red trim the imps left, and you'll cut a figure fit to grace any court. Move along there. You're blocking the road. The rude order wrenched my thoughts back to the present. A soldier, resplendent in leather armor and brandishing an evil-looking pike, was angrily approaching our crude encampment. Behind him, the gate stood slightly ajar, and I could see the heads of several other soldiers watching us curiously. Now that the light was improving, I could see the wall better. It wasn't much of a wall, barely 10 feet high. That figured. From what we had seen since we crossed the border, it wasn't much of a kingdom either. You deaf or something? The soldier barked, drawing close. I said move along. Aahz scuttled forward and planted himself in the soldier's path. Skeeve the Magnificent has arrived, he announced. And he... I don't care who you are, the soldier snarled, wasting no time placing his pike between himself and the figure addressing him. You can't... He broke off abruptly as his pike leaped from his grasp and floated horizontally in mid-air until it was forming a barricade between him and Aahz. The occurrence was my doing, a simple feat of levitation. Regardless of our planned gambit, I felt I should take a direct hand in the proceedings before things got completely out of hand. I am Skeeve, I boomed, forcing my voice into a resonant bass. And that is my assistant you are attempting to threaten with your feeble weapon. We have come in response to an invitation from Roderick V, King of Possiltum. That's right, Bosco, Aahz leered at the soldier. Now just run along like a good fellow and pass the word we're here, eh? As I noted earlier, all this was designed to impress the hell out of the general populace. Apparently, the guard hadn't read the script. He did not cower in terror or cringe with fear. If anything, our little act seemed to have the exact opposite effect on him. A magician, eh? He said with a mocking sneer. For that I've got standing orders. Go around to the back, where the others are. This took us aback. Well, at least it took me aback. According to our plan, we would end up arguing whether we entered the palace to perform in the king's court, or if the king had to bring his court outside to where we were. Being sent to the back door was not an option we had considered. To the back? Aahz glowered. You dare to suggest a magician of my master's stature go to the back door like a common servant? The soldier didn't budge an inch. If it were up to me, I'd dare to suggest a far less pleasant activity for you. As it is, I have my orders. You're to go around to the back like all the others. Others? I asked carefully. That's right, the guard sneered. The king is holding an open-air court to deal with all you miracle workers. Every hack charm peddler for 8 kingdoms is in town. Some of them have been in line since noon yesterday. Now get around to the back and quit blocking the road. With that, he turned on his heel and marched back to the gate, leaving his pike hanging in mid-air. For once, Aahz was as speechless as I was. Apparently, I wasn't the only one the king had invited to drop by. Apparently, We were in big trouble. Chapter 5. Eye of newt, toe of frog. Believed to be the first recipe for an explosive mixture, the forerunner of gunpowder. What are we going to do, Aahz? With the guard out of earshot, I could revert to my normal voice and speech patterns, though it was still necessary to keep my physical disguise intact. That's easy, he responded. We pack up our things and go around the back. Weren't you listening, kid? But what are we going to do about... But Aahz was already at work, rebinding the few items we had unpacked. Don't do anything, kid, he warned over his shoulder. We can't let anyone see you doing menial work. It's bad for the image. He said there were other magicians here, I blurted at last. Yeah? So? Well, what are we going to do? Aahz scowled. I told you once. We're going to pack our things and... What are we going to do about the other magicians? Do? We aren't going to do anything. You aren't up to dueling, you know. He had finished packing and stepped back to survey his handiwork. Nodding in satisfaction, he turned and shot a glance over my shoulder. Do something about the pike, will you, kid? I followed his gaze. The guard's pike was still hanging suspended in mid-air. Even though I hadn't been thinking about it, part of my mind had been keeping it afloat until I decided what to do with it. The question was, what should I do with it? Say, Aahz, I began, but Aahz had already started walking along the wall. For a moment, I was immobilized with indecision. The guard had gone, so I couldn't return his weapon to him. Still, simply letting it drop to the ground seemed somehow anticlimactic. Unable to think of anything to do that would have had the proper dramatic flair, I decided to postpone the decision. For the time being, I let the pike float along behind me as I hurried after Aahz, first giving it additional elevation so it wouldn't be a danger to Gleep and Buttercup. Were you expecting other magicians to be here? I asked, drawing abreast of my mentor. Not really, Aahz admitted. It was a possibility, of course, but I didn't give it a very high probability rating. Still, it's not all that surprising. A job like this is bound to draw competition out of the woodwork. He didn't seem particularly upset, so I tried to take this new development in stride. Okay, I said calmly. How does this change our plans? It doesn't. Just do your thing like I showed you, and everything should come out fine. But if the other magicians... Aahz stopped short and turned to face me. Look, kid, he said seriously. Just because I keep telling you you've got a long way to go before you're a master magician doesn't mean you're a hack. I wouldn't have encouraged you to show up for this interview if I didn't think you were good enough to land the job. Really, Aahz? He turned and started walking again. Just remember, as dimensions go, Claw isn't noted for its magicians. You know Master, but Masters are few and far between. I'm betting that compared to the competition, you'll look like a real expert. That made sense. Aahz was quite outspoken in his low opinion of Claw and the clods that inhabited it, including me. That last thought made me fish for a bit more reassurance. Aahz? Yeah, kid? What's your honest appraisal of my chances? There was a moment of silence before he answered. Kid, you know how you're always complaining that I keep tearing down your confidence? Yeah? Well, for both our sakes, don't push too hard for my honest appraisal. I didn't. Getting through the back gate proved to be no problem, mostly because there wasn't a back gate. To my surprise and Aahz's disgust, the wall did not extend completely around the palace. As near as I could see, only the front wall was complete. The two side walls were under construction, and the back wall was non-existent. I should clarify that. My statement that the side walls were under construction was an assumption based on the presence of scaffolding at the end of the wall, rather than by the observation of any activity going on. If there was any work being performed, it was being done carefully enough not to disturb the weeds, which abounded throughout the scaffolding. I was beginning to have grave doubts about the kingdom I was about to ally myself with. It was difficult to tell if the court was being convened in a garden, or if this was a courtyard losing its fight with the weeds and underbrush which crowded in through the opening where the back wall should have been. Having grown up on a farm, my basic education in plants was that if it wasn't edible and growing in neat rows, it was a weed. As if in answer to my thoughts, Buttercup took a large mouthful of the nearest clump of growth and began chewing enthusiastically. Gleep sniffed the same bush and turned up his nose at it. All this I noted only as an aside. My main attention was focused on the court itself. There was a small open-sided pavilion set against the wall of the palace sheltering a seated figure, presumably the king. Standing close beside him on either side were two other men. The crowd, such as it was split into two groups. The first was standing in a somewhat orderly line along one side of the garden. I assumed this was the waiting line. Or rather, I hoped it was, as that was the group we joined. The second group was standing in a disorganized mob on the far side of the garden, watching the proceedings. Whether these were rejected applicants or merely interested hangers-on, I didn't know. Suddenly, a young couple in the watching group caught my eye. I hadn't expected to encounter any familiar faces here, but these two I had seen before. Not only had I seen them, Aahz and I had impersonated them at one point, a charade which had resulted in our being hanged. "Aahz," I whispered urgently, "do you see those two over there?" "No," Aahz said bluntly, not even turning his head to look. "But they're the—" "Forget 'em," he insisted. "Watch the judges. They're the ones we have to impress." I had to admit that made a certain amount of sense. Grudgingly, I turned my attention to the figures in the pavilion. The king was surprisingly young, perhaps in his mid-20s. His hair was a tumble of shoulder-length curls, which, combined with his slight build, almost made him look effeminate. Judging from his posture, either the interviews had been going on for some time, or he had mastered the art of looking totally bored. The man on his left bent and urgently whispered something in the king's ear, and was answered by a vague nod. This man, only slightly older than the king, but balding noticeably, was dressed in a tunic and cloak of drab color and conservative cut. Though relaxed in posture and quiet in bearing, there was a watchful brightness to his eyes that reminded me of a feverish weasel. There was a stirring of the figure on the king's right, which drew my attention in that direction. I had a flash impression of a massive, furry lump. Then I realized with a start that it was a man. He was tall and broad, his head crowned with thick, black, unkempt curls, his face nearly obscured by a full beard and mustache. This, combined with his heavy fur cloak, gave him an animal-like appearance which had dominated my first impression. He spoke briefly to the king, then recrossed his arms in a gesture of finality and glared at the other advisor. His cloak opened briefly during his oration, giving me a glimpse of a glittering shirt of mail and a massive, double-headed hand-axe hung on a belt at his waist. Clearly, this was not a man to cross. The balding figure seemed unimpressed, matching his rival's glare with one of his own. There was a sharp nudge in my ribs. "Did you see that?" Aahz whispered urgently. "See what?" I asked. "The king's advisors. A general and a chancellor, unless I miss my guess. Did you see the gold medallion on the general? I saw his axe, I whispered back. The light in the courtyard suddenly dimmed. Looking up, I saw a mass of clouds forming overhead, blotting out the sun. Weather control, Aahz murmured half to himself. Not bad. Sure enough, the old man in the red cloak currently before the throne gestured wildly and tossed a cloud of purple powder into the air, and a light drizzle began to fall. My spirits fell along with the rain. Even with Aahz's coaching on presentation, my magic was not this powerful or impressive. Aahz, I whispered urgently. Instead of responding, he waved me to silence, his eyes riveted on the pavilion. Following his gaze, I saw the general speaking urgently with the king. The king listened for a moment, then shrugged and said something to the magician. Whatever he said, the magician didn't like it. Drawing himself up haughtily, he turned to leave, only to be called back by the king. Pointing to the clouds, the king said a few more words and leaned back. The magician hesitated, then shrugged, and began gesturing and chanting once more. Turned him down, Aahz said smugly. Then what's he doing now? Clearing up the rain before the next act goes on, Aahz informed me. Sure enough, the drizzle was slowing, and the clouds began to scatter, much to the relief of the audience, who, unlike the king, had no pavilion to protect them from the storm. This further display of the magician's power, however, did little to bolster my sagging confidence. Aahz, I whispered, he's a better magician than I am. Yeah, Aahz responded. So? So if they turned him down, I haven't got a chance. Maybe yes, maybe no, came the thoughtful reply. As near as I can tell, they're looking for something specific. Who knows, maybe you're it. Remember what I told you. Cushy jobs don't always go to the most skillful. In fact, it usually goes the other way. Yeah, I said, trying to sound optimistic. Maybe I'll get lucky. It's going to take more than luck, Aahz corrected me sternly. Now, what have you learned watching the king's advisors? They don't like each other, I observed immediately. Right. Aahz sounded surprised and pleased. Now that means you probably won't be able to please them both. You'll have to play up to one of them. Or better still, insult one. That'll get the other one on your side faster than anything. Now, which one do you want on your side? That was easier than his first question. The general, I said firmly. Wrong. You want the chancellor. The chancellor? I exclaimed, blurting the words out louder than I had intended. Did you see the size of that axe the general's carrying? Uh-huh, Aahz replied. Did you hear what happened to the guy who interviewed before old Red Cloak here got his turn? I closed my eyes and controlled my first sharp remark. Aahz, I said carefully. Remember me? I'm Skeeve. I'm the one who can't hear whispers a mile away. As usual, Aahz ignored my sarcasm. The last guy didn't even get a chance to show his stuff, he informed me. The Chancellor took one look at the crowd he brought with him and asked how many were in his retinue. 8, the man said. Too many, says the Chancellor, and the poor fool was dismissed immediately. So? I asked bluntly. So the Chancellor is the one watching the purse strings, concluded Aahz. What's more, he has more influence than the general. Look at these silly walls. Do you think a military man would leave walls half-finished if he had the final say? Somebody decided too much money was being spent constructing them, and the project was cancelled or delayed. I'm betting that somebody was the Chancellor. Maybe they ran out of stones, I suggested. Come on, kid. From what we've seen since we crossed the border, This kingdom's principal crop is stones. But the general... As I spoke, I glanced in the general's direction again. To my surprise and discomfort, he was staring directly at me. It wasn't a friendly stare. I hesitated for a moment, hoping I was wrong. I wasn't. The general's gaze didn't waver, nor did his expression soften. If anything, it got uglier. "Aahz," I hissed desperately, unable to tear my eyes from the general. Now the king and the chancellor were staring in my direction too, their attention drawn by the general's gaze. "Kid," Aahz moaned beside me, "I thought I told you to do something about that pike." The pike! I had completely forgotten about it. I pulled my eyes from the general's glare and glanced behind me as casually as I could. Buttercup and Gleep were still standing patiently to our rear, and floating serenely above them was the guard's pike. I guess it was kind of noticeable. "You!" I turned toward the pavilion and the sound of the bellow. The general had stepped forward and was pointing a massive finger at me. "Yes, you!" he roared as our eyes met once more. "Where did you get that pike? It belongs to the palace guards." "I think you're about to have your interview, kid," Aahz murmured. "Give it your best and knock 'em stiff." "But," I protested, "it beats standing in line." With that, Aahz took a long, leisurely step backward. The effect was the same as if I had stepped forward, which I definitely hadn't. With the attention of the entire courtyard now centered on me, however, I had no choice but to take the plunge. Chapter 6. That's entertainment. Vlad the Impaler. Crossing my arms, I moved toward the pavilion, keeping my pace slow and measured. Aahz had insisted I practice this walk. He said it would make me look confident and self-possessed. Now that I was actually appearing before a king, I found I was using the walk not as a show of arrogance, but to hide the weakness in my legs. "Well," the general rumbled, looming before me, "I asked you a question. Where did you get that pike? You'd best answer before I grow angry." Something in me snapped. Any fear I felt of the general and his axe evaporated, replaced by a heady glow of strength. I had discovered, on my first visit to the bazaar at Diva, that I didn't like to be pushed by big, loud Deviles. I discovered now that I also didn't like it any better when the arrogance came from a big, loud fellow clod. So the big man wanted to throw his weight around, did he? With a twitch of my mind, I summoned the pike. Without turning to look, I brought it arrowing over my shoulder in a course destined to embed it in the general's chest. The general saw it coming and paled. He took an awkward step backward, realized it was too late for flight, and groped madly for his axe. I stopped the pike 3 feet from his chest, floating it in front of him with its point leveled at his heart. "This pike?" I asked casually. "Ah," the general responded, his eyes never leaving the weapon. "I took this pike from an overly rude soldier. He said he was following orders. Would those orders come from you, by any chance?" The general licked his lips. "I issued orders that my men deal with strangers in an expedient fashion. I said nothing about their being less than polite." "In that case..." I moved the pike 90 degrees so that it no longer threatened the general. "I returned the pike to you so that you might give it back to the guard along with a clarification of your orders." The general hesitated, scowling. then extended his hand to grasp the floating pike. Just before he reached it, I let it fall to the ground, where it clattered noisily. "And hopefully additional instructions as to how to handle their weapons," I concluded. The general flushed and started to pick up the pike. Then the chancellor snickered, and the general spun around to glare at him. The chancellor smirked openly and whispered something to the king, who tried to suppress a smile at his words. The general turned to me again, ignoring the pike, and glared down from his full height. "Who are you?" he asked, in a tone which implied my name would be immediately moved to the head of the list for public execution. "Who's asking?" I glared back, still not completely over my anger. "The man you are addressing," the king interceded, "is Hugh Badaxe, commander of the royal armies of Possiltum." "And I am J.R. Grimble," the chancellor added hastily, afraid of being left out, "first advisor to His Majesty." The general shot another black look at Grimble. I decided it was time to get down to business. "I am the magician known as Skeeve," I began grandly. "I have come in response to a gracious invitation from His Most Noble Majesty, Roderick V." I paused and inclined my head slightly to the king, who smiled and nodded in return. "I have come to determine for myself if I should consider accepting a position at the court of Possiltum." The phrasing of that last part had been chosen very carefully by Aahz. It was designed to display my confidence by implying the choice was mine rather than theirs. The subtlety was not lost on the chancellor, who raised a critical eyebrow at my choice of words. "Now, such a position requires confidence on both sides," I continued. "I must feel that I will be amply rewarded for my services, and His Majesty must be satisfied that my skills are worthy of his sponsorship." I turned slightly and raised my voice to address the entire court. "The generosity of the Crown of Possiltum is known to all," I declared, "and I have every confidence His Majesty will reward his retainers in proportion to their service to him." There was a strangled sound behind me, from the general, I think. I ignored it. "Therefore, all that is required is that I satisfy His Majesty and his advisers that my humble skills will indeed suffice his needs." I turned to the throne once more, letting the king see my secret smile, which belied the humility of my words. "Your Majesty, my powers are many and varied. However, the essence of power is control. Therefore, realizing you are a busy man, rather than waste time with mere commercial trickeries and minor demonstrations such as we have already seen, I shall weave but 3 spells and trust in your wisdom to perceive the depths behind them." I turned and stretched forth a finger to point at Buttercup and Gleep. "Yonder are my prize pair of matched unicorns," I said dramatically. "Would your Majesty be so kind as to choose one of them?" The king blinked in surprise at being invited to participate in my demonstration. For a moment, he hesitated. "I choose the one on the left," he said finally, indicating Buttercup. I bowed slightly. "Very well, your Majesty. By your word shall that creature be spared. Observe the other closely." Actually, that was another little stunt Aahz had taught me. It's called a magician's force, and it allows a performer to offer his audience a choice without really giving them a choice. Had the king chosen Gleep, I would have simply proceeded to work on the creature he had doomed with a word. Slowly, I pointed a finger at Gleep and lowered my head slightly. "Walla Walla, Washington," I said somberly. I don't know what the words meant, but Aahz assured me they had historic precedence and would convince people I was actually doing something complex. "Alakazam Shazam," I continued, raising my other arm. Bibbidi-bobbidi! I mentally removed Gleep's disguise. The crowd reacted with a gasp, drowning out my final "Goo Gleep." My dragon heard his name, though, and reacted immediately. His head came up, and he lumbered forward to stand docilely at my side. As planned, Aahz immediately shambled forward to a position near Gleep's head and stood, watchful and ready. This was meant to imply that we were prepared to handle any difficulty which might arise with the dragon. The crowd's reaction to him, however, overshadowed their horror at seeing a unicorn transformed to a dragon. I had forgotten how effective the disreputable character disguise was. Afraid of losing the momentum of my performance, I hurried on. "This misshapen wretch is my apprentice, Aahz," I announced. "You may wonder if it is within his power to stop the dragon should the beast grow angry. I tell you now, it is not." The crowd edged back nervously. From the corner of my eye, I saw the general's hand slide to the handle of his axe. "But it is within my power. Now you know that the forces of darkness are no strangers to Skeeve." I spun and stabbed a finger at Aahz. "Bobbledy-goop, crumbs and martyrs." I removed Aahz's disguise. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Aahz smiled. Aahz's smile has been known to make strong men weak, and there were not many strong men in the crowd. The audience half trampled each other in their haste to backpedal from the demon, and the sound of screeches was intermixed with hastily chanted protection spells. I turned to the throne once more. The king and the chancellor seemed to be taking it well. They were composed, though a bit pale. The general was scowling thoughtfully at Aahz. "As a demon, my apprentice can suppress the dragon if need be, nay, 10 dragons. Such is my power. Yet power must be tempered with gentleness, gentility, if you will." I allowed my expression to grow thoughtful. "To confuse one's enemies and receive one's allies, you need no open show of power or menace. For occasions such as those, one's powers can be masked until one is no more conspicuous than a stripling." As I spoke the final words, I stripped away my own disguise and stood in my youthful unsplendor. I probably should have used some fake magic words, but I had already used up all the ones Aahz had taught me and was afraid of experimenting with new ones. The king and the chancellor were staring at me intently, as if trying to penetrate my magical disguise with willpower alone. The general was performing a similar exercise, staring at Aahz, who folded his arms and bared his teeth in a confident smile. For a change, I shared his confidence. Let them stare. It was too late to penetrate my magic because I wasn't working anymore. Though the royal troupe and the entire audience was convinced they were witnessing a powerful spell, in actuality, all I had done was remove the spells which had been distorting their vision. At the moment, all of us, Aahz, Buttercup, Gleep, and myself, were our normal selves, however abnormal we appeared. Even the most adept magical vision could not penetrate a non-existent spell. "As you see, Your Majesty," I concluded, "my powers are far from ordinary. They can make the gentle fearsome, or the mighty harmless. They can destroy your enemies or amuse your court, depending upon your whim. Say the word, speak your approval, and the powers of Skeeve are yours to command." I drew myself up and bowed my head respectfully, and remained in that position, awaiting judgment from the throne. Several moments passed without a word. Finally, I risked a peek at the pavilion. The chancellor and the general were exchanging heated whispers over the head of the king, who inclined his head this way and that as he listened. Realizing this could take a while, I quietly eased my head to an upright position as I waited. "Skeeve," the king called suddenly, interrupting his advisor's arguments. That thing you did with the pike, can you always control weapons so easily? Child's play, Your Majesty, I said modestly. I hesitate to even acknowledge it as a power. The king nodded and spoke briefly to his advisers in undertones. When he had finished, the general flushed and, turning on his heel, strode off into the palace. The chancellor looked smug. I risked a glance at Aahz, who winked at me. Even though he was further away, apparently his acute hearing had given him advance notice of the king's decision. "Let all here assembled bear witness," the chancellor's ringing voice announced. "Roderick V, King of Possiltum, does hereby commend the magical skill and knowledge of one Skeeve, and does formally name him magician to the court of Possiltum. Let all applaud the appointment of this master magician, and then disperse." There was a smattering of half-hearted applause from my vanquished rivals, and more than a few glares. I acknowledged neither, as I tried to comprehend the chancellor's words. I did it. Court magician. Of the entire selection of magicians from 5 kingdoms, I had been chosen. Me. Skeeve. I was suddenly aware of the chancellor beckoning me forward. Trying to be nonchalant, I approached the throne. "Lord Magician," the chancellor said with a smile, "if you will, might we discuss the matter of your wages?" "My apprentice handles such matters," I informed him loftily. "I prefer not to distract myself with such mundane matters." Again, we had agreed that Aahz would handle the wage negotiations, his knowledge of magic being surpassed only by his skill at haggling. I turned and beckoned to him. He responded by hurrying forward, his eavesdropping having forewarned him of the situation. "That can wait, Grimble," the king interrupted. "There are more pressing matters which command our magician's attention." "You need only command, Your Majesty," I said, bowing grandly. "Fine," the king beamed. "Then report to General Badax immediately for your briefing." "Briefing about what?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why, your briefing about the invading army, of course," the king replied. An alarm gong went off in the back of my mind. "Invading army?" I blurted, forgetting my rehearsed pompous tones. "What invading army?" "The one which even now approaches our borders," the chancellor supplied. "Why else would we suddenly need a magician?"